Hello everyone, I'm glad you are here tonight. Imagine closing your eyes and drifting into a time where the world felt both familiar and utterly alien. Before we step into the story, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it for you? I find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across different corners of the world, sharing this same quiet moment together. Some of you may be listening late at night, others in the morning, and yet we are all stepping into the same journey. Tonight, we begin exploring what life was like for those who found themselves behind the stone walls and iron bars of prisons in the vast domain of the medieval Roman Empire, a place both feared and mysterious, where rules of survival were as harsh as the punishments that put people there. You might imagine the Roman prisons as grand buildings with iron gates and orderly rows of cells, but in truth they were usually damp, dark, and oppressive spaces hidden away beneath fortresses, courthouses, or city streets. The most infamous of them, such as the Mamertine prison in Rome, were not designed for long-term living. In fact, they were little more than holding chambers, places where accused criminals, debtors, and enemies of the state waited for their trial or their execution. Still, men and women could be kept there for days, weeks, or even months, and during that time, their lives took on a strange rhythm of waiting, enduring, and adapting. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sweat, mold, and smoke from torches fixed into the walls. Light was scarce, often only filtering down through narrow grates or small cracks in the stones above. Prisoners sat chained to the walls, sometimes alone, sometimes crowded with others, listening to the groans, coughs, and whispers echoing off the walls. These echoes became the background music of their days, a constant reminder of where they were. Imagine the silence broken only by the sound of dripping water, the clink of metal, or the sudden outcry of someone in pain or rage. Food was not supplied generously by the authorities. In fact, it was usually the responsibility of family members or friends to bring food to those inside. Without outside help, many prisoners would have starved. Meals, when they came, were simple and rough: stale bread, thin porridge made from barley or millet, or whatever scraps could be brought in. Water was fetched from cisterns, sometimes clean, often not. Yet in those meager meals, there was also comfort, a reminder that the world outside had not forgotten them completely. Imagine the joy of a prisoner hearing footsteps approaching, seeing a loved one appear with a small loaf of bread or a flask of wine. It was more than sustenance, it was a thread of connection to life beyond the walls. Entertainment was scarce, but the human mind always finds ways to escape. Prisoners told each other stories, passing down old tales, gossip from the city streets, or rumors about politics and war. One might lean in close and whisper about the emperor's latest decree, or about a general returning victorious from the provinces. Others shared jokes, crude but welcome, that made the darkness lighter for a few moments. Sometimes, the prisoners carved marks into the walls, scratching out names, prayers, or drawings that revealed their thoughts and fears. These small acts of defiance, etched into stone, outlasted many of their makers. But not every prisoner was equal. Wealth mattered even in chains. A nobleman or wealthy merchant accused of a crime might have his own guarded chamber, furnished with a mattress and access to wine, while the poor were left huddled on the cold floor, chained together. Bribes could soften the experience. Guards were willing to look the other way if paid enough. Some prisoners were even allowed to receive letters, books, or small comforts. For others, the iron collar around their neck reminded them of the stark divide between privilege and poverty. Beyond survival, there was the weight of uncertainty. Few knew what awaited them: release, exile, slavery, or death. This uncertainty gnawed at the mind, making days feel like months. A man might cling to hope, repeating prayers under his breath, believing that fortune or the gods would intervene. Another might sink into despair, lying silent against the wall, waiting only for the end. Yet both shared the same narrow space, their fates tangled together in the dim light of the prison. Outside the walls, life in the Roman world carried on with its festivals, markets, and triumphs. Inside, time slowed to a crawl. The clamor of the city above was muffled, reduced to faint echoes. And yet those sounds were reminders. A procession passing by, the laughter of children, the calls of merchants, all drifting faintly into the ears of those who could not see them. These reminders kept some alive, holding on to the belief that they would one day walk free again. And here is a curious thought. While prisons were feared, they were also places of strange connection. Soldiers brought in captives from faraway provinces, so in a single chamber you might find a Gaul sitting beside a Greek, a North African beside a Roman citizen. Languages mixed, accents overlapped, and ideas flowed in unexpected ways. A prisoner could learn about distant lands, strange customs, or unfamiliar gods simply by speaking to the man chained next to him. In this way, even in misery, prisons became accidental classrooms of culture, places where the empire's diversity showed itself in raw and unfiltered form. This was life in confinement, not merely walls and chains, but a constant struggle to endure, to find moments of meaning, to hold onto identity when everything was designed to strip it away. And yet, in their whispers, their laughter, their prayers, prisoners revealed that even in the harshest corners of the Roman Empire, humanity persisted. There were moments when the weight of imprisonment seemed almost unbearable, yet the human spirit had a strange way of finding cracks of light in the darkest corners. Among the prisoners, a kind of hierarchy often emerged, not formalized but recognized by everyone. The older men who had already spent long stretches behind those walls became advisors to the younger ones. They taught how to conserve strength, how to ration small pieces of bread, how to keep one's mind steady when panic tried to take hold. A whisper of advice might pass along the stone floor, like a secret meant to guard sanity. Sleep when you can, even if the ground is cold. Hum softly to yourself to drown out the cries of others. Imagine the open sky and fields of wheat when despair presses too hard. It was not unusual for small friendships to bloom, fragile yet powerful in their own way. Men who would have ignored one another in the busy streets above now shared stories of their childhoods, their families, their fears. One might describe the smell of olives from his father's farm, another the sound of waves against the docks of a distant port. These conversations were more than passing words. They were survival tools. To remember the world outside was to remind themselves that they were more than captives, that they belonged to something larger than the damp chamber surrounding them. But tension was never far away. With so many people crowded into such tight quarters, disputes flared easily. A scrap of food, a place nearer to the torch, or even the careless word of an exhausted man could spark a fight. Chains rattled, voices rose, and sometimes guards stormed in with clubs to restore order, leaving bruises and blood behind. Yet more often, the prisoners learned that it was better to settle quarrels themselves, for the punishment of the guards was harsher than any insult. Some even turned conflict into a kind of entertainment. Verbal battles, quick-witted exchanges of insults, a grim sort of humor that passed the endless hours. Religion played its role, too, in the lives of the imprisoned. Some whispered prayers to Jupiter or Mars, seeking strength or courage. Others placed their hope in newer beliefs spreading quietly through the empire, gathering courage in the thought of a single God who promised redemption beyond the suffering of this world. In the shadows, a prisoner might trace a symbol into the dirt with his finger, a sign recognized only by a few, and in that small act find a measure of peace. Faith, whether old or new, became a shield against despair. The guards themselves were not faceless monsters, though many prisoners cursed them as such. Some were cruel, enjoying the misery of those under their watch. Others were indifferent, carrying out duties with the detachment of men who had seen too much suffering to feel deeply anymore. Yet a few, only a few, were capable of mercy. A coin slipped discreetly into a hand might result in a blanket allowed into the cell, or a chain loosened just slightly. A friendly word, rare as it was, could brighten an entire day. It is strange to think that even in such a place, kindness could sometimes cross the iron boundary between captor and captive. Outside the prison, life in the empire continued with its spectacles and celebrations, and sometimes prisoners could hear the faint roar of the crowd from the amphitheater. It must have been cruel, hearing joy and cheers while sitting in darkness. Some even wondered whether their fate would lead them to that arena, to stand before beasts or gladiators for the entertainment of thousands. The uncertainty made the sound of those distant games both fascinating and horrifying. a reminder that the empire demanded not only obedience but spectacle. Night inside the prison carried its own peculiar rhythm. When the torches burned low, darkness became almost absolute. The human voice carried differently then, softer, more intimate, as if secrets floated easier through the air. Some prisoners spoke to themselves, repeating old memories aloud to keep them alive. Others wept quietly, hoping their tears would not be heard. And still others dreamed awake, telling their cellmates of the feasts they would hold when freedom returned, describing platters of roasted meat, bowls of figs, jugs of spiced wine, painting vivid pictures that made hungry mouths water even as bellies ached. Strange rumors often flowed through those midnight conversations. Someone claimed to know of a prisoner who bribed his way out by hiding coins in his sandals. Another whispered of a tunnel dug beneath the walls, though none ever saw such a miracle. Rumors spread like smoke, thin and shifting, but they carried hope, and hope was precious. Even if the stories were lies, they gave prisoners something to cling to in the stillness of the night. There were also those who tried to mark the passing of time. Without the sun, without the changing light, days bled into each other. Some scratched lines into the walls, one mark for each day they believed had passed. Others counted heartbeats or measured time by the rhythm of footsteps above their heads. Yet no one could ever be sure, and so weeks could feel like months, months like years. Time in prison was not measured by calendars but by moments of hunger, by visits from family, by the rare gift of a blanket or a kind word. The body grew weaker with each passing day, but the mind often grew sharper. Prisoners learned to read each other's faces, to sense moods in the smallest shifts of tone. They became experts at waiting, at listening, at noticing details that others would miss. Some men who entered as restless and loud grew silent and observant, transformed by the endless hours of staring into shadows. This transformation was not always for the worse. Many found in themselves a patience they never knew existed, a strange strength born of necessity. And through it all, the empire remained a constant presence, an invisible weight pressing down on everyone within those walls. The prisoners might have hated Rome for placing them there, but they also knew they were part of something vast and unyielding, a machine that consumed lives yet bound the known world together. In their chains, they reflected not just on their own crimes or misfortunes, but on the enormity of the empire itself, a force greater than any single man, yet made up of countless individuals, each with their own story. In this way, the prison was a mirror of the empire itself, diverse, harsh, filled with both cruelty and moments of unexpected humanity. To survive there was to understand not only suffering, but also resilience, the strange endurance of the human soul when stripped of all comforts and forced to face itself in the dark. Morning in the prison was not marked by sunlight flooding in, but by the sound of guards moving above, by the scraping of doors, and by the occasional thud of a bucket being lowered down. The prisoners stirred awake not because the world grew brighter, but because the world grew noisier. The smell of damp straw mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies became more pungent as the chamber warmed slightly with movement. Those chained closest to the entrance might receive their share of food first, usually a coarse loaf or a handful of grain. For the rest, it was a waiting game, hoping that nothing would run out before their turn came. Food was always a central concern, and the hunger that gnawed at their bellies was never far from thought. Imagine a man tearing off a small piece of bread, chewing slowly, trying to trick his mind into believing it was enough. Some shared with their companions, others hoarded scraps, hiding them in folds of clothing, though rats were clever thieves and often found what was hidden. Once in a while, a generous visitor from outside might bring a basket with dried figs, cheese, or olives, and that day became one of whispered celebration, a taste of normal life piercing the gloom. Those rare flavors lingered on the tongue, remembered and retold long after the food itself was gone. The guards, knowing the desperation of the prisoners, sometimes used food as a weapon. They would withhold a ration to punish disobedience, or grant an extra crust to reward silence. In this way, they held control not just over bodies but over spirits. Yet this control was never absolute. Within the shadows, prisoners learned to barter. A man with a scrap of bread might trade it for information, for protection, or even for a small service. Hunger created its own economy, and value shifted from gold and silver to crumbs and drops of water. During the long hours of the day, prisoners sought ways to occupy their minds. Some scratched patterns into the walls, weaving spirals and figures that gave their eyes something to follow. Others composed verses in their heads, repeating them over and over until they could recite them like a song. Words became treasures, and storytelling became a currency as valuable as food. One man might recount the legends of Hercules, another might describe the bustling markets of Alexandria, filling the chamber with images of distant places and forgotten adventures. These stories passed time, but they also reminded everyone that there was more to life than chains. The harshness of prison also revealed the ingenuity of those trapped inside. With nothing but scraps, they found ways to create tools or games. Stones could be arranged into patterns for simple board games, and bones left from meals could be carved into dice. A piece of cloth could be folded and refolded, turned into a small object to toss or juggle. These diversions were crude, yet they gave structure to endless hours. In moments of laughter, even hollow laughter, the prison felt less suffocating. Still, cruelty was a constant companion. Punishments for defiance were swift. A prisoner who shouted too loudly, who insulted a guard, or who tried to tamper with his chains could be beaten, deprived of food, or forced into harsher restraints. The threat of such punishments hung in the air like a shadow. And yet, despite fear, some still resisted. Small acts of rebellion, a hidden message, a stolen moment of prayer, a whispered insult passed when the guards were out of earshot, reminded everyone that the human will could not be fully broken. Death was never far from the minds of the prisoners. Some fell ill in the damp, airless chambers, coughing until their voices faded, their bodies growing thin and weak. Without medicine, even a small infection could become fatal. The dead were carried out quietly, their absence noted but rarely mourned aloud. Each death served as a grim reminder of fragility, a warning to those left behind. And yet, paradoxically, each death also sparked reflection. Men who had wasted their lives on gambling, theft, or greed often spoke in the dark about what they would do if ever granted freedom again. These confessions, poured into the ears of fellow prisoners, carried a strange sincerity, for in chains the mask of pride was easier to drop. Sometimes the prison was not only a place of suffering, but also of transformation. A thief might discover discipline in the daily endurance of hardship. A man consumed by anger might learn patience by necessity. Even in misery, change was possible, and some left their cells not only marked by scars, but also carrying a deeper understanding of themselves and the world. The presence of foreign captives added another layer of fascination. Imagine listening to the accent of a man from the eastern deserts, or to the tales of someone who had seen the cold forests at the edge of the empire. These voices brought the vastness of Rome into focus, reminding the others that the empire stretched beyond their comprehension. For some, it stirred longing, for others, fear. But it always added variety to the monotony, proof that even within walls, the world remained wide and filled with stories. At times, a hush would fall over the chamber when word arrived that someone was being summoned. The sound of footsteps approaching, the heavy creak of the door, the call of a name, these moments froze the air. The chosen man might be taken for trial, for questioning, or for punishment. Sometimes he returned, shaken but alive. Sometimes he did not return at all. The uncertainty of those summonses filled everyone with dread, and yet also with a strange relief when it was not their own name called. In such a place, survival was often measured one name at a time. Through all of this, the rhythm of prison life continued. Hunger, whispers, rumors, punishments, small victories, faint laughter, and endless waiting. The walls seemed eternal, but minds wandered far beyond them. In this way, existence in the prison of the Roman Empire was both brutally confined and strangely expansive, a paradox that shaped the lives of those within it in ways that could never be erased. The echoes of chains and whispers carried into every corner of the cell, but what weighed heavier than sound was the waiting. Waiting for food, waiting for news, waiting for a guard to call a name, waiting for something to change. And yet, the strange truth was that change almost never came. Each day mirrored the one before it, and the prisoners learned to build entire worlds in their minds simply to endure the monotony. A man could spend hours staring at a single crack in the wall, following its jagged path as if it were a road leading somewhere beyond the prison. Another might sit with his eyes closed, replaying a single memory again and again until it felt as vivid as the present. The prison became a place where the imagination was both a sanctuary and a trap. Those who still had family or friends outside clung fiercely to their visits. The sound of footsteps approaching the iron gate was enough to stir the entire chamber into hope, even among those who knew the visitor was not for them. When a mother, a wife, or a brother appeared with a bundle of food or clothing, the meeting was brief, often separated by bars or chains, yet it carried the weight of entire worlds. Words spoken in those hurried exchanges were memorized, treasured, repeated aloud afterward as though they were scripture. And when the visitors left, the silence that followed felt sharper than before, like the air itself had grown heavier. Not all had that luxury. Many prisoners were abandoned, forgotten by those outside, either because their families could not help them or because shame had cut ties too deep to repair. These men grew quieter, lonelier, their faces pale with despair. They listened enviously to others speaking of loved ones, yet some found solace in adopting new bonds inside the prison. A fellow prisoner might take the role of brother, father, or companion, filling gaps left by absence. Strange families were formed behind bars, built not on blood but on necessity and shared pain. There were moments when the empire itself seemed to reach down into the prison. A herald's announcement might echo in the streets above, declaring a new law or celebrating a military victory. Sometimes the prisoners could just barely make out the words, carried faintly through cracks and openings. The irony was bitter. While the empire boasted of its power and glory, those trapped beneath its stones were the forgotten fuel that kept the machine turning. They were both inside it and erased from it, citizens and captives, bound by chains not only of iron but of politics and power. At night, stories of escape drifted through the air like smoke. Some spoke of bribing a guard, others of tunnels or disguises. Few truly believed them, yet the act of telling and retelling gave shape to their hopes. A prisoner might lean close and whisper of a man who vanished from his chains, leaving nothing but a broken shackle behind. Was it true? Probably not. But in the darkness, truth mattered less than the spark of possibility. Hope was fragile, but even a fragile hope could carry a man through another night. Punishments, however, reminded everyone of reality. A man caught attempting to flee might be dragged back, bloodied and broken, his example displayed for all to see. The guards understood that fear was as effective as iron, and they used it freely. Yet even fear had limits. Whispers of defiance still spread, not through bold speeches, but through subtle acts, an insult carved into stone, a song hummed in defiance of silence, a chain tugged one extra time in quiet rebellion. These were not grand gestures, but they kept the spark of dignity alive. The physical environment itself played a cruel role. The dampness of the walls seeped into bones, making joints ache, skin blister, and illnesses thrive. Lice and fleas were constant companions, crawling through straw bedding and clothing. Sleep was often broken by scratching, by the restless movements of neighbors, or by the sudden shout of someone trapped in a nightmare. And yet, in a strange way, the prisoners adjusted. The human body adapts even to filth, and soon the unbearable became simply another rhythm of life. They joked grimly that the fleas were their most loyal companions, never leaving their side. For those who had once lived in luxury, the contrast was even more brutal. Merchants who had dined on fresh fish and fine wine now found themselves grateful for stale crusts. Senators who once commanded attention in marble halls now shared space with thieves and beggars. Some bore this humiliation with stoicism, while others raged endlessly, shouting at guards, cursing their fate, or sinking into despair. Yet prison had a way of equalizing men. In darkness, wealth and rank lost much of their shine, and hunger humbled even the proudest. The conversations that filled the air often turned philosophical. What was justice? Why did Rome hold such power over life and death? Was suffering punishment, or was it simply chance? Some argued fiercely, their voices echoing in the chamber, while others preferred to remain silent, lost in private thoughts. The prison became, in its own way, a school of philosophy, where every man tested his beliefs against the harsh realities surrounding him. The lessons were not abstract but carved into the body, the mind, the very rhythm of survival. And always, the outside world remained a haunting presence. The sound of rain tapping against stones, the distant toll of a temple bell, the muffled cheers from an amphitheater, all were reminders that life beyond the walls did not stop. Some prisoners embraced those sounds as proof that the world continued, that freedom still existed somewhere. Others found them torturous, a cruel reminder of what was denied. For both, the effect was the same. The outside world never truly disappeared. It seeped in through cracks and whispers, teasing them with glimpses of a life they might never touch again. In this strange balance of despair and endurance, the prison became more than a place of punishment. It became a crucible, testing each man not only physically but spiritually. It stripped away illusions, revealing the raw essence of what it meant to be human in the shadow of Rome's vast and merciless order. Morning and night blurred together until time itself became almost meaningless, yet the prisoners learned to notice the smallest changes. A draft of cool air might signal that a door somewhere had been opened. A louder echo from above could mean a crowd gathering in the streets. Even the behavior of the guards told a story. When they moved quickly, speaking in hushed tones, the prisoners knew something important was happening outside, though what exactly remained a mystery. This constant guessing became part of survival, for to feel connected to the outside world was to hold on to a thread of identity. Among the prisoners, there was always someone who claimed to know more than the others. Perhaps he had overheard the guards, or perhaps he simply invented tales to pass the hours. Such men became both admired and mistrusted, for their words carried hope but also the risk of disappointment. One might whisper that a new emperor was soon to be crowned, and that with his rise would come amnesties for certain crimes. Another might insist that a great festival was approaching, and that prisoners would be paraded through the streets as part of the spectacle. Whether true or not, these rumors stirred restless energy in the chamber. Even lies had power, for they made men dream. The dreams of prisoners were not only about freedom, but about simple pleasures. A warm bath, clean clothes, the sound of laughter at a tavern, the feel of sunlight on bare skin. These became treasures of the imagination. Some described them aloud in detail, their voices painting images so vivid that the entire group fell silent, listening as though to a sacred ritual. It was not uncommon for men to close their eyes and drift into those shared visions, their minds escaping the walls even if their bodies could not. In these moments, the prison itself seemed to fade, replaced by a world built entirely out of memory and longing. Still, the reality of chains was inescapable. Some men bore heavy iron collars that chafed their skin raw. Others had shackles at wrists and ankles, forcing them to shuffle awkwardly when allowed to move. The sound of chains was constant, a metallic chorus that followed every gesture. At first the weight was unbearable, bruising flesh and exhausting muscles, but over time the body adapted, growing calloused where metal pressed hardest. The prisoners joked grimly that the chains were like old friends, always near, never silent. Violence sometimes erupted, though rarely in the way it did on the streets. In the prison, space was too confined for prolonged fights, and the risk of punishment too great. Yet moments of rage flared suddenly. A man might strike another over a piece of bread, or lash out in frustration at endless waiting. The others usually intervened quickly, pulling the fighters apart before the guards arrived. For though they quarreled, they knew that unity, however fragile, was their best defense against the cruelty of those who watched over them. One of the strangest aspects of prison life was how the mind clung to rhythm. A man might count his breaths, or recite prayers in steady repetition. Another might tap a pattern on the wall, each beat marking time in a place where clocks did not exist. These rituals became anchors, helping them endure when days dissolved into one another. In some cases, entire groups joined together, chanting softly in unison, their voices rising and falling like waves. To outsiders it might have sounded eerie, but to those inside, it was a lifeline, proof that they were not entirely alone. Not every prisoner endured in the same way. Some broke quickly, collapsing into silence, their eyes distant and vacant. They ate when food was given, slept when exhaustion overcame them, but otherwise drifted like shadows, already gone in spirit. Others seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, finding purpose in comforting others, telling stories, or simply refusing to give in. These men became pillars for the group, living reminders that endurance was possible. Their presence was a shield, though they themselves often carried invisible burdens heavier than their chains. Occasionally, new prisoners were brought in, and their arrival disrupted the fragile balance. They entered with fresh wounds, with fear still raw in their eyes, or with anger blazing. Their stories were eagerly devoured, for they brought news from the outside, rumors of war, of famine, of political intrigue. But their presence also stirred unease, for they represented the unknown. Would they share food or hoard it? Would they bring trouble or peace? The chamber shifted subtly each time a new face appeared, as though the walls themselves held their breath. Among the most unsettling experiences was hearing the cries of torture or execution from other parts of the prison. Though the prisoners themselves were rarely allowed to witness such events, the sounds carried through the stone. A scream cut short, a chain dragged across the floor, the dull strike of a club, these noises filled imaginations with dreadful pictures. Silence afterward was almost worse, for it left unanswered questions. Who had suffered? What fate awaited the rest? The uncertainty gnawed at them like hunger. And yet, even in the midst of fear, humor found its place. A crude joke whispered in the dark could spark muffled laughter, a reminder that not even Rome's prisons could extinguish human wit. Some men made fun of the guards, imitating their voices or exaggerating their mannerisms. Others invented silly tales, claiming that mice held secret councils in the walls or that fleas were spies of the emperor himself. Such humor was rough, sometimes absurd, but it offered relief. For a moment, the prisoners were not captives, but men sharing laughter, united by the ridiculousness of their situation. As days stretched on, many reflected on their past lives. Regrets surfaced. Business deals gone wrong, quarrels that had led to violence, debts that had spiraled out of control. Some swore that if given another chance, they would live differently, with greater care or humility. Whether they truly would, no one could say. But in the quiet, those confessions felt genuine, heavy with the weight of men who had nothing left to hide. In a strange way, the prison became a place of truth, where masks were stripped away, leaving only the bare soul exposed. Thus the cycle continued. Hunger, whispers, fleeting joys, crushing despair, and endless endurance. The Roman prison was not only a place of punishment but a theater of human survival, where every man became both actor and audience in a play that had no certain ending. Life inside the Roman prisons was not only about physical suffering, but also about the crushing psychological weight of uncertainty. Many prisoners were not told how long they would remain in confinement. Some were awaiting trial, which could take months or even years, while others already knew their fate would be exile, slavery, or execution. This waiting, without a clear end, ate away at their minds. Imagine being locked in a dark, damp room with no idea if you would ever see the sun again, listening only to the groans of others who had been forgotten. For many, the torment of not knowing was worse than the shackles around their wrists. The guards who patrolled these prisons were often brutal men, hardened by years of service and tempted by corruption. Bribery was common, and those who had families or friends with wealth outside could sometimes secure better treatment. A loaf of bread smuggled in, a blanket, or even a bit of wine to dull the pain of existence. For the poor, there was nothing but silence and decay. Still, whispers filled the air, stories of prisoners who had managed to escape by bribing the right person or by finding a weak spot in the old stone walls. Most of these tales were just illusions, but they gave desperate men a fragile thread of hope to cling to. Food was always scarce, And what little was provided often came from charitable citizens who delivered offerings for the poor, not from the state itself. Bowls of porridge, coarse bread, and sometimes dried beans or lentils might be passed down into the darkness. But for many, hunger was a constant companion. There were even accounts of prisoners chewing on pieces of leather or gnawing on bones that had already been stripped clean. Hunger reshaped the human mind, turning friends into rivals and making even the smallest morsel a treasure worth fighting over. Despite the cruelty, there was a strange social order that developed among the prisoners. The stronger men took charge, often dominating the weaker ones, but sometimes they formed protective groups. In a space where survival depended on alliances, friendships could emerge in the unlikeliest of places. A thief might share his bread with a political prisoner, or a runaway slave might trade stories with a captured soldier. For a moment, the divisions of the outside world blurred, replaced by the simple truth that they were all trapped together in the same misery. Entertainment was scarce, yet humans always find ways to occupy their minds. Some prisoners scratched marks into the walls, counting the days or carving crude images of animals, gods, or their families. Others told stories, recounting the legends of heroes like Hercules or the myths of Jupiter's wrath. Storytelling became a way to escape, if only for a little while, from the grim reality around them. A voice in the darkness could transport them to the bustling streets of Rome, to the grandeur of temples, or even to memories of harvest fields and family homes. These spoken words became lifelines in the dark. And yet, not all who entered those prisons were destined to remain long. Some were dragged out suddenly, often without warning. A name might be called, and a man would vanish through the iron door, never to return. Sometimes it was for a trial before a magistrate, sometimes for a public flogging, and sometimes for execution in the arena. The others would listen in silence, knowing that tomorrow it might be their turn. This constant shadow of death haunted every corner of the prison, making even the smallest sound from above, a guard's footsteps, the rattling of keys, enough to send fear through the hearts of men. But within this darkness, there were also tales of survival, of prisoners who endured for years and were finally freed. When such men emerged, they often carried with them scars not only on their bodies but in their souls. They had lived through the belly of Rome's cruelty, witnessing the worst of human despair. To hear them speak afterward was to hear voices shaped by shadow, voices that carried both bitterness and wisdom. Beyond the prison walls, every inmate carried the heavy knowledge of Rome's brutal punishments. For some, the mere rumor of being sent to the arena was enough to break their spirit long before any trial. They knew that the Colosseum and smaller amphitheaters across the empire demanded a steady supply of bodies to entertain the masses. Criminals, rebels, and even unlucky debtors could find themselves standing on sand, facing wild beasts or armed gladiators. Inside the cells, this fear was spoken of in whispers, like a curse that could not be shaken. Men wondered if their names were already written on a list, waiting to be called. This looming threat shaped daily life in captivity. Those who believed they were destined for execution often lost the will to eat or speak, falling into silence as if already gone. Others clung to desperate hope, bargaining with the gods through prayer or trying to bribe guards for a chance at mercy. A strange economy of survival flourished in these hidden corners, where favors were traded for information and where the smallest rumor could change the mood of dozens. News of an upcoming festival in Rome, for example, could send waves of terror because festivals meant games, and games required victims. Inside the darkness, the senses sharpened in unnatural ways. Prisoners learned to recognize the rhythm of approaching footsteps, the squeak of a key, the sound of a heavy door scraping against stone. Each noise could mean a beating, a ration of food, or the dreaded moment when a name was called. Some prisoners swore they could even sense death lingering, as if the very air grew heavier before someone was taken away. Superstitions grew, spreading like wildfire through the ranks of the condemned. It was said that if a rat abandoned a corner of the cell, someone in that corner would soon die. Others believed that certain carvings of protective symbols on the walls could shield them from cruel fate. The presence of slaves in these prisons added another layer to the atmosphere. slaves accused of rebellion or theft often faced even harsher prospects than free citizens, since their lives were already considered expendable. Many of them knew they would never be ransomed or rescued, unlike wealthier prisoners who might hope for outside intervention. And yet, among the slaves, there was often a fierce will to endure. Some whispered of uprisings, recalling the legendary revolt of Spartacus generations earlier, and though most of these dreams never left the dark air of the cell, they provided a spark of defiance in a place where hope was rare. Food remained a central obsession. Even when scraps of bread or bowls of watery porridge were delivered, fights could erupt over the distribution. The stronger men hoarded, while the weak begged or stole in the chaos. Yet there were rare moments of kindness too. A hardened thief might slip a crust to an old man, or a soldier might share dried figs smuggled in from outside. These small gestures mattered more than grand sacrifices, because they reminded the prisoners that they were still human, even in a place designed to strip away humanity. The stench of the cells was unforgettable. Human waste, mold, and the sourness of unwashed bodies clung to every stone. Fresh air rarely reached the depths of the prison, and torches gave off smoke that stung the eyes and lungs. Disease spread quickly in such conditions, with fevers and infections claiming lives before any official punishment could. In some ways, sickness was its own executioner, silently moving through the prisoners with no need for a judge's verdict. Still, even amid all this suffering, life carried on in strange ways. Prisoners exchanged stories about their lives outside, the fields they once worked, the ships they sailed, the marketplaces they knew. For a brief moment, in those shared words, they could imagine themselves walking free in the sun, hearing the cries of merchants or the songs of street performers. This act of remembering was a rebellion of its own, a way to preserve identity against the crushing weight of Rome's justice system. Religion filled the void that despair carved inside the Roman prisons, and even the darkest corners of those cells carried echoes of prayer. Prisoners turned to the gods in desperation, whispering invocations to Jupiter, pleading with Mercury for cunning, or begging Mars to give them strength. Some clung to the goddess Fortuna, hoping that chance might yet shift in their favor. It was common for men to trace rough symbols into the dirt or carve tiny altars into the stone, using pebbles, scraps of cloth, or whatever fragments they could gather. These makeshift shrines, fragile and secret, became places where prisoners poured out their last hopes. But the worship was not always uniform. In a single cell, one man might pray loudly to Apollo, another might mutter to Diana under his breath, while yet another offered silent devotion to obscure household spirits, the Laras and Penates he had grown up honoring. Some even carried amulets or charms hidden in their clothing, little tokens from mothers or wives, believed to shield them from death. In a world where the empire seemed indifferent to their suffering, faith became the one force they could still choose for themselves. Not all prayers went to the old Roman gods. By this time, whispers of new and foreign beliefs sometimes spread even into the prisons. Stories of a mysterious sect called Christians reached the ears of some, men and women who worshipped a single god and promised eternal life beyond suffering. Though many considered these stories dangerous and blasphemous, others found comfort in them. A prisoner facing certain execution might be drawn to the idea that his pain was not the end, but the beginning of something greater. Of course, if the guards suspected such faith, punishments could be harsh, yet forbidden hope has a way of surviving even in chains. At night, when the prison fell into silence except for the coughs and groans of the sick, you might hear soft chanting. It was not always organized or melodic, but it carried a strange power. Dozens of voices, cracked and weak, blending into something greater than themselves. For a moment, those voices drowned out the dripping water, the scurrying rats, and the creak of old wood. It was as if the prisoners reminded themselves that Rome could control their bodies, but not their souls. Religion also influenced the way prisoners interpreted the events around them. A sudden death from fever might be seen as a punishment from the gods. A crumb of extra bread might be hailed as divine favor. Even the smallest changes in the daily rhythm of the prison took on cosmic significance. Men debated endlessly whether omens meant salvation or doom. Did the appearance of a raven outside the prison yard foretell freedom or execution? Did a sudden storm mean the gods were angry, or that they were preparing to wash away old sins? This constant search for meaning was not only superstition but also survival. Without belief, many would have collapsed under the weight of hopelessness. With it, even the weakest could endure another day. The guards mocked them sometimes, calling them fools for praying to gods who never answered, but the prisoners knew that faith itself was the answer, the one thing that could not be stripped from them. Still, there were darker tales too. In the silence of those dungeons, some prisoners claimed to feel cursed. They spoke of shadows that moved even when no torch burned, or whispers in the stone that seemed to come from the spirits of the dead. Whether these were true hauntings or the hallucinations of starving, sick men, no one could say. Yet the fear of unseen forces was as real as the iron bars. Faith, whether in gods or in ghosts, ruled every hour of their confinement. Public punishment hung over every prisoner like a shadow, and even those who never saw the light of day inside the prison could not escape its echo. The roar of distant crowds sometimes reached their ears when festivals or games were held. They knew too well what those cheers meant. Somewhere, another condemned man was being led out into the arena, perhaps forced to fight trained gladiators, perhaps thrown helplessly before wild animals. The knowledge of these spectacles tormented those who waited in their cells, because in Rome punishment was not only about law, it was about spectacle, about turning suffering into entertainment for thousands. When guards entered the prison to collect names, the atmosphere changed instantly. Men who had spent days muttering prayers or telling stories would fall into silence, staring at the floor, terrified that their name might be called. Some begged openly, clutching at the guards' legs, offering whatever scraps of wealth or promise they had left. Others met their fate with grim acceptance, rising without a word and disappearing into the dark corridor. For those who remained behind, the silence afterward was heavy. Sometimes they would never learn what became of the man, though in their hearts they often knew. Executions outside the amphitheater were no less brutal. Crucifixion remained one of the empire's most feared punishments. The condemned would be marched through the streets, beaten and jeered at by crowds, before being nailed or tied to wooden crosses along the roads leading into Rome. Prisoners inside the cells dreaded this fate more than any other, for it was slow and public. They spoke in hushed tones of bodies left to hang for days under the burning sun, a warning to all who passed by. Even those who would never face it could not escape the terror of imagining such an end. Some punishments were more symbolic than physical. Exile could seem like mercy, yet for Romans, being cut off from the city and their community was a death of another kind. Prisoners who hoped for exile knew that they might survive, but they would lose everything: family, status, and the familiar rhythms of Roman life. Others were condemned to slavery, sold in markets to strangers, stripped of their freedom forever. For some prisoners, this prospect was worse than death, for it meant a lifetime of servitude with no hope of release. What made these punishments even more cruel was that the prisoners often did not know which fate awaited them until the very last moment. One day a man might believe he would be released, and the next his name was called and his life ended in the sands of the arena. The unpredictability gnawed at the prisoners' sanity. They lived in a constant state of dread, rehearsing their possible deaths in their minds over and over. And yet, amidst this dread, there were stories of those who survived the spectacle. Sometimes, if a condemned man fought bravely enough in the arena, the crowd might demand his life be spared. The will of the people could sway the hand of an emperor or magistrate, granting unexpected mercy. Such tales spread quickly through the prisons, fueling both hope and envy. Every prisoner imagined himself as the one who might win freedom by sheer courage, though few ever did. The very architecture of Rome reminded them of what awaited. From their cells, some prisoners could glimpse the distant outline of the Colosseum or hear the hum of the city preparing for games. It was a cruel reminder that the same empire that built aqueducts, roads, and temples also perfected the art of punishment. Rome wanted its people to see justice not as quiet administration, but as theater. Inside the suffocating darkness of the Roman prisons, order emerged where Rome had imposed only chaos. Prisoners, left without guidance, created their own hidden hierarchies and systems of survival. The strongest often claimed leadership, not only through physical power but also through cunning. A thief who knew how to barter with guards, a soldier who had endured campaigns, or even a silver-tongued orator awaiting trial could rise as a figure others followed. These men became decision-makers in a place where decisions meant life or death. Rules formed, unwritten yet fiercely obeyed. Food, for example, was a constant source of conflict. Leaders often organized its distribution, deciding who ate and who starved, though fairness was rare. Loyalty was rewarded, defiance punished, sometimes with violence carried out in the shadows of the cell. But this order also gave some prisoners a fragile sense of structure. Amid the despair, knowing one's place, whether as leader, follower, or outcast, brought a strange kind of stability. Resistance to Roman authority, though small and often desperate, also thrived. Prisoners carved messages into the walls, some as simple as names, others as coded signs that only fellow captives could understand. A scratched symbol might mark a place where food was hidden, or signal which guard could be bribed. These acts, though minor, were rebellions against the silence Rome tried to enforce. Even a single carved word was proof that the empire had not fully erased a man's existence. Storytelling, which had always been a lifeline, took on an organized shape. Certain prisoners became known as keepers of tales, voices that carried legends, histories, or even jokes to lighten the crushing weight of captivity. A shared story was more than entertainment. It was glue that held the fractured community together. Men who had once fought on opposite sides of Rome's wars could laugh or mourn at the same tale, momentarily forgetting the iron bars that surrounded them. Some groups even formed bonds of protection. Weaker prisoners, old men, boys, or those too sick to defend themselves, sometimes found allies in stronger companions. These alliances were not always born of kindness. Sometimes they were pragmatic, ensuring loyalty or future favors. Yet they still provided safety in a place where a lone man was easy prey. Over time, these bonds resembled families, fragile but real, forged in the shared misery of confinement. Religion also shaped these communities. Prisoners gathered around shared gods or beliefs, forming circles of prayer that brought them closer. A man praying to Mercury might lead others in chants for cunning and luck, while whispers of Christianity continued to spark quiet gatherings that Roman guards could not always detect. Faith united men who might otherwise have nothing in common, giving them the strength to endure together. Even resistance to guards took collective form. When corruption or cruelty became unbearable, prisoners sometimes acted as one. Refusing food, shouting curses in unison, or creating disturbances when the guards opened doors. These small rebellions were dangerous, but they reminded Rome that even in chains, the human will could not be fully broken. The Roman state believed prisons were places of silence and submission, yet inside, they became laboratories of survival and resistance. Every whispered story, every shared crust of bread, every scratched mark in stone was proof that even the might of the empire could not strip men entirely of dignity. Time inside the prison had a strange, distorted quality, bending and stretching in ways that could drive a man to madness. Without clocks or sunlight reaching the deep cells, prisoners measured days by subtle rhythms, the sound of a guard's morning steps, the distant toll of a temple bell, or the faint shifts in temperature as the seasons changed outside. Even the dim light that filtered through cracks or high windows marked the passing of time, though often barely noticeable. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, and yet every prisoner counted them, marking invisible calendars in their minds. The seasons affected life in ways more profound than the outside world might imagine. In winter, the damp cold seeped into bones, making muscles stiff and joints ache. Those who could not move freely huddled together, seeking warmth from others' bodies. Layers of straw bedding and scraps of cloth were cherished treasures. Food scarcity worsened as outside donations slowed and rations provided by guards sometimes diminished. Frosted floors made every step painful, and the nights felt endless, stretching the imagination into dark, lonely corridors. Spring and summer brought their own torment. Heat trapped inside stone walls became suffocating. The stench of sweat, unwashed bodies, and refuse intensified. Water, a rare commodity, grew precious, and the guards' cruelty often escalated. Yet prisoners noticed small signs of life: the occasional bird perched near a barred window, a distant sound of flowing water, the faint smell of flowers or herbs carried by the wind. These reminders of the world beyond the walls were treasured, small moments of beauty amid unrelenting despair. The rhythm of daily routines became essential for survival. Morning, when food might arrive, was met with anxious expectation. Midday brought a strange mix of boredom and tension, as men waited for guards' rounds or whispered stories to pass the time. Evening, with shadows lengthening, was a time for prayer, reflection, or storytelling. Night could be the most terrifying, filled with the groans of the sick, the scurrying of rats, and the eerie sounds that imagination transformed into curses or omens. Every prisoner adapted to these rhythms differently, finding ways to endure the relentless cycle. Mental games became a lifeline. Men counted their breaths, repeated prayers, or memorized lists of emperors, gladiators, cities, or gods to keep their minds sharp. Others engaged in whispered debates, philosophical discussions about justice, morality, and fate. These discussions often meandered into heated arguments, but even conflict provided structure, a way to feel alive when the body was otherwise trapped. In some cells, music appeared as a faint lifeline. A man with a crude flute or a bone whistle could fill the space with sound, however limited. Others hummed or clapped rhythms, inventing songs that spoke of freedom, hunger, or past lives. Music became an invisible thread connecting prisoners across the darkness, reminding them of shared humanity. Even as the prison imposed a rigid schedule of suffering, men found ways to mark the passage of time creatively. Scratched lines in walls, knots in ropes, and tally marks in dirt were all attempts to measure survival, to assert some control over the uncontrollable. These acts, though small, were profound gestures of defiance, proof that even in captivity, humans could leave traces of themselves. Interactions between prisoners and guards were a delicate dance of fear, cunning, and occasionally reluctant respect. The guards held absolute power in the cells, their presence a constant reminder that life and death rested at their discretion. Some were cruel by temperament, delighting in the display of authority and the fear it provoked. They would prod men with sticks, shout threats, or withhold food for minor offenses, ensuring the prisoners understood the cost of disobedience. Yet even among these men, patterns emerged, predictable behaviors that prisoners could exploit, however subtly. Bribery became a common survival tool. A small coin or a hidden piece of bread could earn a guard's favor, allowing a prisoner a few extra morsels or the chance to rest undisturbed. Those who managed to navigate these shadow economies gained small privileges, yet the price was constant vigilance. Trust was fragile. A misstep, a bribe discovered, could result in immediate punishment, sometimes meted out in front of the other prisoners as a warning. Guards themselves sometimes competed, trading favors or exploiting prisoners' fears, adding another layer of complexity to life behind the walls. Despite the fear, some prisoners found unexpected moments of kindness. A guard might quietly offer water to a man weakened by illness, or turn a blind eye to minor infractions. These rare gestures carried immense weight, transforming despair into fleeting hope. Prisoners remembered them for years, clinging to the notion that even within an oppressive system, glimpses of humanity persisted. Some even relied on these small acts strategically, learning which guards were susceptible to flattery, which ones could be reasoned with, and which should be avoided entirely. The psychological tension between fear and trust defined daily life. Prisoners constantly observed guards, analyzing tone, gait, and mood. A sudden shift in the sound of boots on stone could signal danger or a new opportunity. Those adept at reading these subtle cues often survived longer, using observation as a weapon when brute strength or resources were lacking. Small conversations, whispered pleas, and even feigned illness became tactics in an ongoing battle for survival. Punishment within the prison often reinforced the guard's authority while serving as a spectacle for the other prisoners. A man caught stealing a morsel of bread or attempting to communicate with outsiders might be chained in public view or flogged across the cold stone floor. The sight of such suffering instilled obedience, yet it also inspired subtle acts of resistance. Prisoners would share food secretly, whisper encouragement, or hide messages carved into walls, maintaining a fragile sense of autonomy even in submission. Some prisoners sought to manipulate the system by creating alliances with guards. A young, clever man might ingratiate himself with a sympathetic soldier, gaining access to small comforts or information about events outside the prison. Others found themselves under the control of a single, capricious guard whose mood dictated their daily fortunes. These relationships were fraught with risk. Any miscalculation could end in brutal punishment or death. Still, navigating these dynamics became a vital skill, and those who mastered it carved out relative safety in an otherwise merciless environment. Conversation with guards sometimes blurred the line between submission and defiance. Prisoners learned to phrase requests carefully, to appear obedient while subtly asserting dignity. Some would joke lightly, daring to test a guard's temper in ways that, if handled skillfully, could earn respect. Others remained silent, speaking only when necessary, each word weighed like gold. Over time, these interactions created a complex social web where power shifted subtly and constantly, shaped by fear, cunning, and the rare moments of mutual understanding. In essence, the prisoners and guards coexisted in a tense equilibrium, each shaping the experience of the other. Life in the Roman prison was not only a matter of enduring iron bars and hunger, but also of mastering the human dynamics within. Every interaction, every glance, every whispered word became a thread in the intricate fabric of survival, a delicate balance between fear, resistance, and fleeting connection. Amid the relentless oppression, prisoners developed secret rituals and small cultural practices that became lifelines of sanity, invisible to the guards yet vital to survival. In the darkness of the cells, men devised ways to mark the passage of time, to create order where Rome provided only chaos. Some would tap rhythmic patterns on stone walls, a kind of Morse code of human endurance, sharing news of outside events or signaling solidarity. Others whispered songs or poems, their melodies faint but persistent, binding the men together through sound even when visibility was non-existent. Games, simple yet fiercely competitive, became a rare source of diversion. A carved piece of wood could serve as a token in dice games, with rules invented on the fly. Stones and scraps of cloth were used for strategy contests, while riddles and verbal challenges tested memory and wit. These activities were more than amusement. They reinforced community, maintained cognitive sharpness, and offered a fleeting sense of control in a world designed to strip all autonomy. Even the smallest victory, winning a game or successfully tricking a fellow prisoner in jest, brought a spark of dignity and reminded them they were still thinking, still alive. Storytelling evolved into its own elaborate practice. Certain prisoners became chroniclers, preserving oral histories, myths, and legends with astonishing fidelity. They recounted the exploits of Roman heroes, tales of God's wrath, and the exploits of past emperors, weaving in observations of prison life with subtle humor or moral lessons. In some cells, these stories were ritualized. One prisoner would speak while others listened in reverent silence, a nightly practice that gave rhythm to the endless days. The act of storytelling also reinforced memory, preserving identity in a place designed to erase individuality. Some prisoners developed shared spiritual practices beyond the official Roman pantheon. Secret prayers to distant gods or to ancestral spirits were accompanied by the creation of small altars, often nothing more than pebbles arranged in careful patterns or a scrap of cloth pinned to the wall. These tiny shrines were intensely personal and fiercely guarded. The act of devotion offered hope and a sense of agency, a ritual in which they could influence the divine even when human authority had stripped them of all control. Rituals of solidarity also emerged. When a prisoner fell ill, groups might gather to whisper encouragement, share scarce water, or massage stiffened muscles. In some cases, they even created makeshift medicines from scavenged herbs, dandelions, or other vegetation they managed to sneak in. Though primitive, these practices were symbolic acts of community and resilience, reminders that in darkness, humans still sought to care for one another. The mental and emotional energy spent on these practices was immense. Some prisoners dedicated hours each day to memorizing prayers, rehearsing songs, or perfecting games. Others meticulously counted days, carved secret symbols, or recorded events in invisible codes. Each act was a method of resistance, a way to assert the presence of mind and spirit when the body was powerless. This cultivation of culture, ritual, and memory was subtle yet profound, a rebellion of thought and imagination against the suffocating reality of confinement. Even humor found its way into these rituals. Crude jokes, clever wordplay, and sarcastic observations about guards, the city, or even the gods themselves helped maintain mental balance. Laughter, however faint, reminded prisoners of the absurdity of life, the endurance of human spirit, and the possibility that joy could exist even within stone walls. In a place designed for suffering, such glimpses of levity were treasures beyond measure. Illness and injury were constant threats in Roman prisons, where the combination of damp stone, crowded cells, and inadequate nutrition created a breeding ground for disease. Fever, dysentery, and infections spread quickly, claiming lives often before any official sentence could be carried out. Prisoners learned to recognize the early signs, chills, persistent coughs, or unusual weakness, and developed desperate strategies to survive. Some relied on scraps of herbs smuggled in by guards or fellow prisoners, while others used simple rituals, touching carved symbols or murmuring prayers, in hopes of divine intervention. Injuries, whether inflicted by guards, fellow prisoners, or accidents, were equally dangerous. Without proper medical care, even a minor wound could fester, turning life-threatening. Prisoners shared knowledge of makeshift treatments, poultices made from crushed plants, wrapped tightly with scraps of cloth, or splints fashioned from wood and leather. Sometimes, the strongest among them would tend the injured, applying pressure to bleeding wounds or massaging cramped limbs. These acts of care, however modest, carried immense significance, reminding the sick that even in despair, they were not entirely alone. The psychological toll of sickness and injury was equally severe. A prisoner lying feverish on a cold stone floor faced not only physical pain but a creeping sense of isolation and mortality. Observing others succumb heightened anxiety, and rumors about the fate of the weak spread like wildfire. Men whispered about those who had died quietly in the night, their absence noted only by a new silence or the hollow echo of empty steps. This awareness reinforced the fragility of life, sharpening both fear and the instinct for survival. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, worsened the conditions. Stone floors and walls, damp with condensation or urine, invited lice and other parasites. Infestations were inevitable, gnawing at both body and mind. Prisoners devised methods to combat them, rubbing herbs into hair, shaking out bedding, or even burning small piles of straw to drive pests away. These minor victories against disease and filth offered not only relief but a fragile sense of control in an environment otherwise dominated by chaos and cruelty. Death itself became a silent companion. Prisoners grew familiar with its signs: pallor, fever, labored breathing. Yet they also learned how to distance themselves emotionally, developing coping mechanisms to endure each day. Some would pray more fervently, others would focus obsessively on rituals, while a few took solace in storytelling, creating elaborate narratives to distract themselves from the encroaching inevitability. Humor, even dark humor, emerged again as a lifeline, as laughter could briefly hold the shadow of death at bay. Social dynamics played a critical role in survival during illness. Stronger prisoners often controlled access to food and water, determining who received care and who was left to struggle alone. Alliances and favors could make the difference between life and death. Yet even in these harsh realities, acts of empathy occurred. A man might quietly offer a portion of his bread to a sick companion or shield him from the worst of the guard's cruelty. Such small gestures created invisible bonds, a network of support that preserved life in a place designed to erode it. Psychological endurance became as important as physical survival. Prisoners developed mental exercises, counting, reciting prayers, or rehearsing memories of life outside to maintain a sense of self. They learned to anticipate the moods of guards, predict the arrival of rations, and manage scarce resources with meticulous care. In a world stripped of autonomy, these strategies allowed them to cling to fragments of dignity, preserving the mind even when the body weakened. Memories of life beyond the prison walls were both a blessing and a curse, haunting the minds of prisoners with vivid images of freedom they could no longer touch. Men remembered the warmth of the sun on open fields, the laughter of children in marketplaces, and the smell of bread baking in small ovens at home. These recollections offered solace, a mental escape from the cold stone cells, but they also sharpened the pain of confinement, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Prisoners often shared stories of their former lives, weaving detailed recollections that became almost rituals in themselves. A soldier might recount campaigns along distant borders, the smell of gunpowder, or rather, in this era, the scent of sweat, dust, and leather armor mixed with the exhilaration of battle. A merchant could describe bustling markets, the bartering of goods, and the vivid colors of fabrics and spices. Even the most mundane activities, like fetching water from a spring or tending to livestock, became cherished memories that provided a sense of identity and continuity. Some prisoners clung to these memories as a form of resistance. By reliving their pasts, they refused to be reduced entirely to a body in a cell, stripped of autonomy and dignity. The mind became a sanctuary, a place where Roman walls could not reach. Men rehearsed conversations with family members, recounted festivals, or mentally walked through streets they could never again traverse. This exercise of memory strengthened their resilience, offering psychological nourishment in the absence of food and comfort. Yet the longing for freedom also bred despair. Prisoners compared their current suffering to the vivid life they remembered, amplifying the sense of loss. The distance between memory and reality could be crushing, creating waves of hopelessness that sometimes manifested in apathy or illness. Some men began to retreat inward, speaking less, interacting less, their minds consumed by the impossible gap between past and present. Others, however, turned these memories into motivation, imagining eventual release or a chance to survive against the odds. Prisoners' memories also fueled subtle rebellions. They would recall the routines and habits of their guards, the layout of cells, or the timing of patrols, storing information that could one day be useful in escape attempts. Even if freedom was never attained, the act of planning, of strategizing, gave men a sense of agency, however faint, in a world designed to strip it away. Memory became both shield and weapon, preserving hope and self-determination in parallel. Interactions among prisoners were heavily influenced by these recollections. Sharing memories of past joys, meals, or communal activities reinforced solidarity and fostered empathy. Men who had never met might find common ground through similar experiences, childhood games, harvest festivals, or battles fought for honor and survival. These conversations were lifelines, creating micro-communities within the oppressive environment, where human connection helped stave off the dehumanizing effects of captivity. Even in the darkest hours, memories of family, food, and freedom acted as subtle reminders of what was possible outside the walls. They offered guidance in the form of moral lessons, how to survive, whom to trust, and how to preserve one's mind when the body was weak. By holding on to their past, prisoners maintained a core of identity that Rome could never fully erase, proving that even in chains, humanity endured. Rumors and news from the outside world acted like fragile threads of hope, weaving through the prison and shaping the moods, alliances, and even survival strategies of the inmates. The guards, whether deliberately or carelessly, sometimes carried scraps of information, whispers of battles in distant provinces, changes in imperial decrees, or the arrival of visiting officials. Prisoners clutched these tidbits, analyzing every word, debating its truth, and imagining how it might affect their fates. Some rumors sparked hope, though often fleeting. A story that a governor was considering pardons for certain prisoners could ignite a surge of energy and cooperation. Men would strategize, polishing behavior to curry favor, saving hidden food to trade for opportunities, or preparing messages to petition officials. The mere possibility of release transformed lethargy into activity, motivating prisoners to endure hardships that might otherwise have crushed them entirely. Other rumors, however, brought terror. Talk of new laws, executions, or public spectacles of punishment spread like wildfire. A distant festival could become a source of dread because games demanded victims, and even prisoners far from Rome feared being chosen. In these moments, whispers carried through the cells like a contagion of anxiety, prompting nervous behavior, frantic plotting, and sometimes conflicts over interpretation. Who believed the news? Who doubted it? Debates could become heated, alliances shifting with each new report, as trust and skepticism dictated survival. The exchange of rumors also reinforced the hidden social networks within the prison. Certain prisoners became trusted sources of news, and their credibility could elevate them to positions of informal authority. Others, less careful, might spread misinformation unintentionally, causing panic or discord. Yet even false rumors served a purpose. They engaged the mind, allowed conversation to flow, and reminded prisoners that life continued outside the walls, connecting them to a world they could not touch but could still imagine. These whispers influenced both practical and emotional behavior. Some men would attempt small acts to capitalize on a rumor, trying to bribe guards, gather extra provisions, or manipulate alliances in anticipation of impending events. Emotionally, the news became a roller coaster, shifting hope into despair and back again with every fragment of information. In a place where daily survival was uncertain, the mind clung to these threads as desperately as it clung to food and water. Even the smallest external event, a festival in a nearby city, a soldier passing by, or a message delivered from a merchant, was magnified in importance. Prisoners debated its significance, interpreted it as either omen or promise, and allowed it to shape their internal rhythms. Some prayed more fervently after hearing good news, while others became sullen and withdrawn at reports of tragedy. Life within the cell, though physically contained, was thus intertwined with the movements of the empire, with every external ripple influencing the internal world of captivity. In this environment, hope was fragile but necessary. It could spring from the faintest whisper, a coin tossed over a wall, or a fleeting conversation with a guard. Without it, despair became all-consuming, yet with it, prisoners found reasons to endure hunger, filth, and the looming threat of death. Rumors and news were not merely information, they were psychological sustenance, invisible yet vital, shaping behavior, alliances, and the very structure of life behind bars. Life inside the prison grew stranger as men adapted to the rhythms of confinement, blending fear, hope, and ingenuity into survival. Over time, prisoners began to establish routines that transcended simple existence, creating small microcosms of society within the stone walls. Each day brought predictable tasks, fetching water, tending to makeshift bedding, distributing rations, but these tasks became ceremonies of endurance, performed with care to preserve both body and spirit. Food remained a constant struggle. Bread, often stale and meager, was supplemented by whatever scraps prisoners could acquire or barter. Herbs, roots, and small plants brought in secretly became precious additions, sometimes used to make broths or poultices for the sick. Prisoners developed subtle systems of trade, exchanging favors, sharing resources, and creating hidden economies that the guards rarely noticed. A coin here, a portion of bread there, a whispered message exchanged. These small acts allowed men to assert some control over a world designed to strip it away. Beyond physical survival, psychological endurance was paramount. Prisoners honed their minds, practicing memory exercises, mental storytelling, and quiet reflection. Some recited the names of emperors or gladiators, others memorized entire poems or religious chants, and a few even developed mental maps of the prison's layout to navigate escape or hide supplies. Every thought, every memory, became a tool to maintain a sense of self and purpose amid relentless monotony. The social fabric of the prison also deepened. Alliances and friendships shifted like tides, influenced by the distribution of food, the temperament of guards, and the ebb and flow of hope. Men who shared secrets, warned each other of danger, or offered small kindnesses gained loyalty and protection. Conversely, betrayal or selfishness could result in violence, isolation, or subtle forms of retribution. Within this microcosm, the prisoners created unspoken codes, rules that allowed them to survive together even under constant pressure. Faith continued to play a central role. Some prisoners found solace in traditional Roman gods, constructing small shrines or murmuring prayers. Others turned to emerging beliefs, whispering stories of distant Christian sects or venerating ancestral spirits. Rituals, however modest, offered structure and purpose. Lighting a candle, tracing symbols in dust, or reciting prayers became acts of resistance against the crushing weight of captivity, affirming that while Rome controlled their bodies, it could not fully command their minds. Stories and gossip remained powerful forces within the prison. Tales of mercy, brutal punishment, or strange occurrences from outside the walls traveled quickly, often shaping decisions, inspiring caution, or igniting hope. Prisoners clung to these narratives, analyzing every detail, seeking clues about impending changes in fortune. Even rumors of festivals or new laws could alter behavior, subtly influencing the distribution of resources, social alliances, and mental states. Isolation and companionship existed in uneasy balance. Some prisoners preferred solitude, retreating into their own thoughts or memories, while others thrived in shared rituals and secret communities. The interplay of these tendencies shaped the daily life of the prison, influencing mood, morale, and survival. Those who learned to navigate both solitude and social engagement often endured longer, finding strength in both reflection and connection. Even the architecture of the prison, stone walls, iron bars, narrow corridors, played a role in shaping daily existence. Shadows shifted with the movement of torches, creating patterns that prisoners interpreted as omens or guides. Small cracks and crevices became hiding places for food, messages, or personal artifacts. Every physical feature of the environment carried meaning, whether practical or symbolic, as prisoners adapted to the constraints imposed upon them. Amid all this, the constant presence of mortality was a unifying thread. Death occurred frequently, silently, and often without ceremony. Yet even in witnessing loss, prisoners maintained resilience. They learned to observe, mourn privately, and move forward, integrating the ever-present specter of death into the fabric of daily life. Survival was not merely physical. It was a continuous negotiation between fear, ingenuity, hope, and the human instinct to endure. Acts of defiance and rebellion were subtle at first, whispered between prisoners, then bolder as courage or desperation grew. Some men carved secret symbols into walls, not merely as reminders of existence but as coded messages for allies. These marks indicated hidden food caches, warned of approaching guards, or even mapped potential escape routes. Each scratch in stone was a quiet rebellion, proof that even under iron and stone, the human spirit could leave a trace. Attempts at escape were rare and perilous, yet they became legendary among prisoners. Men observed guards meticulously, noting patrol schedules, shifts in temperament, and weak points in locks or chains. Some tried small experiments, slipping through gates left slightly ajar, hiding in shadows during transport, or bribing sympathetic guards with coins or favors. Even failed attempts were instructive, teaching others about vulnerability and opportunity, and forging unspoken networks of strategists who shared knowledge cautiously. Prisoners also rebelled in subtler ways. Refusing to eat, singing forbidden songs, or mocking authority through whispered jokes and gestures were methods of psychological resistance. Guards could punish them, yet these acts were small victories of autonomy, allowing men to assert identity and pride where physical power could not. Humor, sarcasm, and clever wordplay became survival tools, allowing prisoners to maintain mental resilience against relentless oppression. Power struggles within the prison often intertwined with rebellion. Some men leveraged alliances, using cunning to challenge dominant figures or redistribute resources. Leadership was fluid, earned through intelligence, courage, or charisma. Negotiations, threats, and displays of loyalty shaped these hierarchies, creating a dynamic ecosystem where strategy mattered as much as strength. These internal politics could either stabilize the community or ignite conflict, depending on the personalities involved. Even religion played a role in defiance. Secret gatherings, prayers to distant gods, and small rituals were acts of spiritual rebellion, asserting faith in the unseen and the divine over the physical authority of Rome. A quietly repeated prayer, a clandestine altar, or a group chant carried profound meaning, demonstrating that captivity could not fully dominate the soul. In these acts, prisoners cultivated ingenuity. Simple tools, scraps of metal, wood, or cloth, became instruments of survival, mischief, or escape planning. A bent nail could unlock a chain, a hidden knife could provide protection, and scraps of cloth could mark paths or hide messages. Creativity became as essential as strength, and those who could think several steps ahead often survived longer than the physically strongest inmates. Rebellion also relied on patience. Men waited for opportune moments, guard rotations, lapses in vigilance, or external events that distracted the authorities. Timing was everything. A poorly planned attempt could end in brutal punishment. Yet even the planning process, the anticipation, and the shared excitement of secret knowledge created psychological sustenance, giving prisoners a sense of agency in a world designed to remove it. Finally, rebellion intertwined with community. Acts of defiance were rarely undertaken alone. They required observation, coordination, and trust. Sharing intelligence, covering one another's mistakes, or quietly celebrating small victories forged bonds of solidarity. In these shared struggles, prisoners discovered collective power, learning that even in chains, cooperation could challenge the dominance of Rome, however subtly.